welcome to the Institute of Science and Technology's AI Special Interest Group online seminars, introduced by me, Richard Saldanha. These seminars aim to explore a wide range of AI-relevant topics with invited experts, everything from algorithms and ethics to societal concerns and AI explainability. I'm delighted to introduce Tjeerd Fokkens from Gothenburg University, Sweden, to you today. Tjeerd originally comes from the Netherlands, where he studied both physics and mathematics in Utrecht and Delft, before undertaking his current research aimed at understanding human reasoning. In today's talk, Tjeerd will cover his research group's approach to simulating human logic behavior. Tjeerd.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm delighted to talk about my research. That's always a very nice thing to do. First, I'd like to say that if you have any small questions, like things that are unclear or some minor comments, please let me know straight away. You can interrupt me. Right, just to give you an overview of the whole talk. This is the overview. So I'll first give you a short introduction to my research and with a focus on how to situate my research within AI. AI is a very wide topic, of course, and I take up a particular spot in that. Then I'm going to explain you what ALE is. I mean, we all know what ALE is, but this is a different kind of ALE. It's a description logic. That will all become clear. This description logic will be the first ingredient of my research. The second ingredient is ACT-R. ACT-R is a so-called cognitive architecture. So it is a blueprint of the mind, of the brain. And that's the second ingredient in my research. I combine the two to make a model with which I can predict certain types of human behavior in logic. The fourth point is, I will be discussing what it is that I see with my research, and lastly, the goals for the future. So let's start with the introduction. So, I think that current AI focuses on two things, namely prediction and performance. So, some people might be interested in time series analysis and market predictions and stuff. And they want to predict accurately what a certain price of a product is going to do. Then you are dealing with prediction and you want to be as accurate as possible. But there's not so much of explanation going on there. Really, the accuracy of prediction is the main goal there. Or AI tries to optimize a certain performance. An example in that is, for example, chess computers. Chess was long considered to be the pinnacle of human intelligence, because chess was hard and grandmasters are surely very clever people. So it was quite a shock when chess computers beat the world champion in I think the 90s, early 90s, or late 80s it was. And since then, research in chess computers have left this human performance standard, and they have just optimized their engines way beyond what can be compared to humans, reaching an 4000 ELO level recently, which is very, very high. So yeah, a lot of strains in AI research follow sort of the same dynamic, it's about outperforming humans mainly. That's not what I'm doing. My focus is on explanation, and I keep this human benchmark in my research as a goal. So the system that I'm trying to make should model exactly what humans do. I'm not interested in outperforming humans. I'm interested in making a machine that predicts exactly how humans perform on a certain logical reasoning task. So that is some very high overview of where to situate this whole project, something to keep in mind. Right, let's move to the first ingredient, ale. I'm going to first say some things about description logics in general. Then the atoms, roles, the intersections, and existential restrictions are the main things we can do within this logic. It all becomes clear in the end. I don't know if there are any logicians in the room, but I will try to keep it accessible. Right, description logic or description logics. What is that? It's a formal language, or actually a family of different formal languages, and each member of the family differs in expressivity and computational complexity. And these description logics form the basis of knowledge bases and ontologies. So knowledge bases and ontologies are certain databases where some extra information, some terminological information can be used to infer new facts from the data. And the advantage of this is that you don't have to encode every fact in the database, because then the database would be too big. Rather, certain general facts are combined with specific facts to derive everything you want to be derived. Examples of these knowledge bases are SNOMED, which is a medical knowledge base, gene ontology, maybe some people are familiar with that, I don't know, and FIBO, which is a financial and business ontology. I'm not an expert in those applications really, but I just know that these are just a selection of a wide variety of these ontologies and knowledge bases. So that's what they're used for. Now, ALE is one particular type of description logic. ALE stands for attributive language with existential restriction, and it's a logic about concepts. And I thought about this as to just dive straight in how this logic works, such that you get a real flavor of what you can do within this logic. So firstly, we have the simple atomic concept statements. They are depicted like this, and these are abstract formulas. So they have no semantic content yet, but we can assign all sorts of meanings to these symbols. One way of doing it is, for example, this. The first formula we see could mean Alice is a comedian, right? So that's what it says. It says something about an element A, and it falls under the concept of C, like being a comedian. The second formula is Alice is not a comedian. So this little hook thing, it's a negation sign, and that means exactly that it is not the thing that comes after. Right, so if we have these two formulas together, I just want to mention this, these formulas together can't be both true, right? Alice cannot both be a comedian and not a comedian. So this is an example of a clash, that will, I will talk about that later, just to keep in mind, just for you to keep in mind what a clash is. In this logic, we can express also roles, which are formulas of this form, and an example of a meaning of this could be this: Alice roasts Bob. So we see that we have two elements, A and B. A stands for Alice, B stands for Bob, and they are related by the role R, which we can interpret as the role roasts. And like in any logic, every symbol might have a different meaning depending on your purpose, what you want to do with the logic. But this will be a running example throughout the rest. Right. Moving on to the more complex concept assignments, we can make intersections. So intersections are if an element falls under two simpler concepts, for example. So this formula says that A falls under the concept intersection of C1 and C2. So if we write that down in natural language, it could mean something like this. Alice is a cynical comedian, where C1 stands for cynical and C2 for comedian. Now, from this fact, from this complex concept, we can derive two other formulas straight away. And you might not be surprised that it is these formulas. And they both stand for the following two natural sentences. Alice is cynical, which is the first formula, and Alice is a comedian, which is what the second formula says. So now we have an example of reasoning, of an inference step. And for the following two concept constructors, we also have similar reasoning inferences. So let's discuss existential restrictions. They are denoted by this upside down E. This might look a little bit weird, but yeah, that's so what it means is that this element A has an R successor, which is a C. So we don't know what this R successor is. We don't know the name of this R successor. This formula just claims that there is one. So in our running example, this might mean Alice roasts some comedian. And from this formula, we can again infer two things. The first thing is this formula. This is a role formula that we have seen earlier. And we can, this role formula would mean that there is a certain X that Alice roasts. And we can conclude that this X is a C, so that this X is a comedian in natural language. So we have again made an inference step here. Then lastly, we have the universal restrictions. They are denoted by this upside down A, and they say that something holds for all R successors of a certain element, in this case A. So this means that all things that Alice roasts are comedians. Note, however, that we do not claim the existence of anything or anyone that Alice roasts. So this formula only says that if there is something or someone that Alice roasts, then we know that this thing or this person is a comedian. Right? So if we have this formula in our set of formulas that we reason with, we could combine it with the following formula if we also have it. Right? So if we have this role formula saying that A and B are related by the role R, then we can combine these two formulas to infer the next one, which, so this means that Alice roasts Bob. So we can conclude this formula. B is a C, meaning that Bob is a comedian. So here we do sort of the converse of what we did earlier. Earlier we had one formula from which we derived two. Now we need two formulas from which we derive one. And that is really all there is to this logic. This is a rather simple logic. In this logic we can have a certain reasoning problem, which can be expressed as follows. A set of formulas in this logic is called an A box, and an A box we can see here, right? This is a simple A box. It consists only of two formulas. An interesting thing about this A box is that it contains a clash. This, you might not be able to see this directly, but the first formula says that A falls under the concept C, and the second says that A falls under the concept negation C, so not C. And there we have the same situation again, where A is both a C and not a C, which is not possible, so that's a clash. Now, the task of A box consistency, that is what we're interested in, or that's what I study in my research, A box inconsistency, that is to find out if for a given A box there is a clash, or some clash can be derived from it or not, right? And it's precisely this task that I am trying to model. So I might I might present a human subject with a set of formulas like this, and then ask him or her, is there a clash or not? And then I want to predict the time it takes for this person to reach the conclusion. Right, so how do I do that? I do that by using my second ingredient, namely ACT-R. I'll first discuss the overall structure of ACT-R. Then I will say what chunks are, what production rules are, and if I have enough time, I will go into the subsymbolic processes. That's a little bit technical, but it would help you understand so much more. I think I have time for that. We'll see. And that will give you at least a flavor of a basic understanding of what this thing is. And this is what it looks like. So let's spend some time on this slide. ACT-R is a so-called cognitive architecture. So this means that it is a blueprint of the human mind, the human brain as well. It is an integrated theory where results from a wide variety of cognitive psychological experiments are being put together to form a coherent, integrative theory of human cognition. And human cognition is basically human behavior in terms of learning, forgetting, reasoning, things like those. It doesn't deal with emotions or those things. So we see here all these modules on the rim, these colored modules, and every module has a specific task. It's a specialized unit designed for a specialized task. So we have the goal module, which is involved in planning. We have a declarative module, which is basically your declarative memory. So all the memory, all the facts that a person knows is encoded in that module. And we have a manual module, which deals with how the hand moves. And there is a lot of other modules. And all these modules are connected to a central module, which is called the procedural module. And they are connected with it through buffers. So we see these colored buffers as well. And in each buffer, there can only be one so-called chunk. What a chunk is, I will explain later, but it can only contain one of those. So these buffers form a sort of bottleneck in the whole model. Now, this procedural module contains production rules, and I'm also going to tell you later a little bit about that more in detail. But these are action or condition action rules. So if certain conditions are met, a certain action needs to be performed. So that's basically your procedural knowledge, the knowledge that you cannot put into words. It's just skills, things you do automatically, right? Now, one more thing that is very interesting about ACT-R is that every such module can be related to a particular part of the brain, certain brain structures. So for example, this procedural module has in brackets the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia is a brain structure. It is a brain structure that connects the left and right hemisphere. And it is thought that whatever happens in the procedural module from a theory perspective maps onto whatever actually happens in a human brain within that same structure. And we know, for example, the size or the average size of this structure, so the length of neurons, etc. And if we also know the average speed with which signals travel among these neurons, we can predict the time it takes or yeah, how long these processes in the procedure module take. And likewise, all these other modules are connected can be related to certain brain structures. Right, so that's an overview of ACT-R. Right, so I said earlier that declarative information is encoded into chunks. And these buffers that I talked about can only contain one chunk, right? So what does a chunk look like? I have made a chunk here, and I've called this chunk fact I, very boring name, but yeah, that's how I called it. Lack of creativity, probably. These chunks can have arbitrarily many slots, and arbitrarily many I put in quotation marks because there are some from a modeling perspective, let's say, it is not realistic to have very many slots available in a chunk. But exactly how many you need to have, or how many is realistic, is not really clear. This chunk that I've depicted here is a chunk representing a formula in ALE. And the formula it represents is stated in the formula slot. A, B is an R. It has more slots, like element 1, which is taken up by Alex. Element 2 is Bob, and a role, which is roasts. So this chunk contains information of the logical formula and also how we interpret it. The actual way how I do it is a little bit more complicated than this. But the basic idea boils down to this, that every formula that you can have in ALE can be represented by a chunk in ACT-R. So that's the first step on doing logic. The second step of doing logic is performing the actual logic. Yeah, okay, we'll come back to this later. Performing the actual logic, the inferences in the logic, and that I can do with the production rules. These production rules are in the procedural module, right? This central module in any ACT-R model. These production rules looks like this. It's basically condition action rules. So if certain conditions are met, then a certain action needs to be taken. In this case, we have as the conditions that the goal, if the goal is to make an inference, and if this particular formula is in buffer 1 can be any one of those buffers, it doesn't really matter which one. And if we have this other formula in buffer 2, then we can create a chunk for the formula B is a C. So this corresponds exactly to these inferences that you can make in ALE. This is just an example of one of those inferences, but all the like the other two inference steps that you can make can also be modeled similarly within ACT-R. And also here, the real production rules look very, much more complicated than this one, but this is basically how it works. Right, I messed up a little bit the order of presenting things, so I go back to this previous slide again, where in the last sentence here, at the bottom, I say that every chunk has an associated activation. And now it gets a little bit technical. I think I should have enough time to go into these details. But this is where it gets interesting, because we are, like any model made with ACT-R, is not only a symbolic model. It's not only a set of condition action rules. It's more complicated than that. ACT-R allows us to make a more nuanced picture of human behavior. And it does this in multiple ways, but one of the ways in which it does it is use of activation. So every chunk, let's say each chunk I, has an associated activation AI, which models how likely and how quickly it is retrieved from memory. So all these chunks are stored in the declarative memory, and at many points in a certain thinking process, we need to retrieve from that memory certain information. And chunks with a high activation can be retrieved very, very quickly. Chunks with a low activation, not. This activation is subject to a certain decay, and that is given by this formula. I once heard that with every formula you lose half of your audience. I hope in this audience it's not half. I hope you can deal with these formulas like this. Let me hop over quickly. This formula can be depicted in this graph. So what do we see in this graph here? We see these spikes here, and these spikes are the times at which this particular chunk is activated. Either it is stored in memory, or it is modified in the memory, or retrieved from memory. And then we see then that the activation goes up. And after a while there is a decay, so the activation goes down. This is how we forget things. This is a mathematical model of how we forget things, and it is quite accurate. At some point, the activation will drop below a certain retrieval threshold, after which you cannot retrieve that particular chunk anymore. So then you have completely forgotten about the fact. Now these chunks, or the activation of these chunks, can be increased if a certain chunk is activated multiple times, which means in my project that if a certain formula is being inspected multiple times, it has a high activation and is very accessible to think about. And that might affect human reasoning. That's the idea. Right, there's two more formulas coming. Very sorry about that. But we have the retrieval latency, which is modeled by this formula at the bottom, and the retrieval probability, which is modeled by that formula. And they are both based on the activation on this A, right? So both, the time it takes a certain chunk can be retrieved, and the probability with which this can be done is modeled by this activation. Now, my model is called SHARP, and I made it within this ACT-R, Cognitive Architecture. SHARP stands for Simulating Human A-Box Reasoning Performance. It's not a very nice acronym when you write it out, I guess, but I like the acronym itself, SHARP. I think that's a very nice name. So that's how that's why we picked it. This is a very high level overview of what my system looks like. I will go through it quickly because it doesn't really matter. The details don't really matter that much. We have module 1 here, where a clash is found among atoms, or a clash is trying to be found among atoms. If there's no clash among the atoms, then module 2 is invoked, where a new formula is inspected to be derived. And depending on which formula it selects, it goes to module 3, 4, or 5. So if a conjunction, or let's say concept intersection, is found, then it goes to module 3. And for existential and universal restrictions, it goes to module 4 or 5 respectively. And then it derives new formulas by going back to module 2, and it tries to look for a clash by going back to module 1. That is sort of how it works. So we see that everything you can do within the description logic ALE can also be done in this model. And we try to predict the inference times, right? So what do we see when we actually do that? We have this A box that we looked at earlier, and we saw that we have a clash here. And one of the things I'm interested in is whether it plays a role if people switch between inspecting formulas, or if they continue reasoning with the same formula and only then go to the next formula, like after they made all inferences that they could make on the first. So I model this by, or I conceptualize this by looking at switches. So people could have 0 switches where they don't switch between the formulas, or they can have 1 or 2 switches in this particular example. And what we get is the following. This might take a while to load. This was a way too big file. Yeah, there it is. So on the horizontal axis, we see the inference times. That is what we're trying to predict here. It's measured in seconds. And we have 3 graphs here, one with 0 switches, one with 1, and one with 2 switches. And we see that the one with 0 switches, so when a person, or person inspects one formula and only after making all the inferences on that formula then goes to the first, we see in that situation, so with 0 switches, that the inference time generally is a little bit longer than in the other 2 cases. And in the cases of 1 or 2 switches, the inference time is the shortest. That is one interesting and counterintuitive effect. I know why this happens. It has to do with some technicality in the model. I'm not going to go into detail with that, or at least not for the moment. Maybe you have questions afterwards. But another very interesting fact about these is that these sample sizes between 0, 1, and 2 switches are not the same size. The sample size with 0 switches is actually way bigger than the one with 1 switch, and the one with 1 switch is also way bigger than the one with 2 switches. That is not depicted in this graph, but it tells us that humans are actually most likely to inspect one formula thoroughly and then go on to the next formula instead of hopping back between formulas, even though that might speed up their thinking process. So yeah, that's one sort of prediction I can make with my model, and there are many more predictions I can make. So yeah, like I said, some runs, that's what I call an order of inspected formulas. Some runs are more likely than others. I can also see that if you look at an existential restriction first and then a universal restriction, that is faster than if you do it the other way around. That's one thing I can predict with my model. And another thing is that some A boxes allow for a wide spread in inference times, and other A boxes don't. If, for example, an A box has superfluous formulas, so formulas that do not contribute to the clash that is there, then people might spend time on thinking about those formulas or not, and that gives a big difference in inference times. Some people might be very quickly at spotting the clash, and other people might spot the clash much later because they do inspect those superfluous formulas. And another thing I predict is that the order of formulas does not matter. So if we go back quickly to this slide, had I switched the order of these 2 formulas around, it would be the same inference times that we see. Whether that is an accurate prediction or not, I don't know. That is something to look for in the future, and in fact that is my first goal. That's what I'm going to talk about now, a little bit looking at the future. So I want to experimentally test my model and see if the things that I predict with it are actually valid, and if humans actually reason like this, or, well, if they reason to some extent similar to what I predict. Another thing is that I want to define, or yeah, I want my models, I want to use my model's predictions to define a complexity measure on logical entailments. That allows me to determine whether some logical entailments are easy or hard, and exactly how easy and how hard they are. If I know that, I can optimize debugging of knowledge bases. So these knowledge bases that I mentioned in the introduction, they often need debugging. And if something follows from a knowledge base that is unexpected, we want to trace back where this information comes from, and we want to present the human user with the simplest proof of that fact, such that debugging is easiest. And with this complexity measure, I will be able to do that. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening to me and for being here. I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something, or yeah, it would be even better if you are inspired by something. I'm very much willing to answer some questions that you might have. Yeah, thanks, and just let me know.
That's great. Thank you, Tjeerd.
Thanks.
I'm sure people have questions. If people would like to indicate if they'd like to ask a question, perhaps introduce themselves, stating their institution and asking away. Very happy for Tjeerd to take questions now.
Shall we just stop the screen share, Richard, and then we can see everybody? Excellent.
There we go. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I mean, whilst you're thinking, I have a question. Well, general observation and a bit of a question here. First, my sort of observation. This is a really nice framework actually for thinking about how a human brain works, and it marries together some really nice, well, mathematical logic, which I happen to be reasonably familiar with more sort of computational concepts. And I immediately started thinking about neural networks, particularly in terms of activation function, although in a neural network, we use different types of activation functions. Would you care to sort of elaborate on that, please, Tjeerd?
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting point because, like, as we know, the brain is a very, very complicated system, right? And we can study the brain at a very low level, which is neurons, basically, or at a very high level, where we consider the brain as a black box and study what comes in and what comes out, basically. ACT-R is a sort of compromise between those two levels. It tries to sit in the middle of those things. So it doesn't really extend as far down as the neuron level, but it also doesn't extend as far up as the fully complex human behavior, let's say, right? It only focuses on certain cognitive tasks. People have tried to expand ACT-R, and I know that in Groningen there is a research group busy with that. I think they call it PRIMS. I think that's the name they give to it. They basically want to extend ACT-R downwards by incorporating it with neural network like architectures and mechanisms. And they also want to extend it upwards by allowing the system to also combine different tasks and to allow it to think more analogically with analogs and stuff, analogies, let's say. So there's it's an active area of research, but very much to be done still. It's a complicated problem.
Right. Thank you. So got a question here from Simon. Simon, would you like to read your question out? Because I think in the recording, the chat gets lost. Oh, you're on mute, I'm afraid, Simon. Sorry. Should be able to hear you now.
I think I
No,
don't.
sorry, Simon. I'm afraid your mic isn't working. I'll read it out for you. So Simon's asking, is it possible to define the difference between existential inferences and universal restrictions?
Right, yes. Yeah, that's a good question. I think, let me see if I can put my slides up. Maybe that's best.
Sure, go ahead.
Where do I have them? Right there. Yeah, I'm not a Zoom master, as you can see, but I think I have it here. This should work. So now let's go to full screen. Right. So let's go back a bit to the logic. Yes. So yeah. So here we have existential restrictions, which are formulas of this form. And yeah, what does this say? So we have this element A, and the colon stands for is a. So A is a thing that that has some R related object to it, and this R falls under the concept C. So that's what this existential restriction means. So it basically, yeah, it claims the existence of some element related to the element under consideration, and also some additional info on that element. For universal restrictions, though, that says something about all elements that are related to some element A. So there might be many elements related to A, right? And by looking at this formula here, this formula claims something about all those elements at the same time. It says that all those elements that are related by A are comedians in this sense. So if we look at it a little bit more formally, we have here one formula, namely this existential restriction formula, from which we can deduce two different formulas, namely stating that there is an element X which is related to it, and also that this X falls under a certain concept. In the universal restriction case, we do sort of the opposite here. Well, yeah, not the opposite really. Logically speaking, not the opposite. But what happens here is that we have two formulas from which we derive one. Because we need to use this formula as well, this saying that A and B are related by a rho R. Only then can we deduce that this B is a C. Because this first formula doesn't claim any existence of an element related to A. It only says that if there is an element related to A, then that element is a C. So we go from two formulas to one. Is that an answer to the question?
Simon posed this question.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you very much, Simon, for your question. Great.
Right. Do we have any questions from anyone else? People are being very quiet today. I'll be greedy and ask another question, if I may.
Oh, yes.
I'm just wondering about sort of practical implementation. What plans do you have for that, if any?
Right, yeah. So in terms of practical applications, the goal is really to have this measure on logical entailments, right? So practically speaking, like what I have now is a model that simulates human reasoning, and that's a very computationally intensive task. It takes a lot of time to compute this, or to get a reliable estimate of an inference time, because there is some how do you say that, non-determinism in the model. So what I want is to have a simple way to compute the same things in a much simpler and much less computationally complex way. I have several ideas about that. One is to use symbolic regression. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that. I think that's a useful and it might be a how do you say that? I have hope that this technique will help me in computing these things more easily. The idea is that you just derive a formula from a certain A box with which you can easily calculate the average inference time or whatever. If we can do that to a certain extent of accuracy, that would be very nice. Now, if we have that, we can apply this to make proofs easier. To make proofs, that's already implemented. There is a lot of software for that finds certain types of proofs, also minimal proofs in some sense. But of course, we want to minimize the proofs that it finds according to this human complexity measure, right? Instead of some sort of syntactical measure. So that would be the next step to really implement this. Haven't really thought about that yet. I think I will first focus on actually experimentally verify my model and see if it's any reasonable approximation to what really happens. But yeah, so that's basically the step. So we have a measure, and then according to that measure, find the minimal proof. That's the idea here. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So let's see if we have any late questions at this point. Everyone's very quiet today. No, I don't think we've got any further questions. So just remains for me to basically thank you on behalf of the IST and the audience present for a really interesting and very clear presentation. Thank you, Tjeerd.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for attending very much. Yeah.
Brilliant. And if you enjoyed this seminar, you might like to take a look at our istonline.org.uk website. We very much look forward to seeing you at a future seminar, and we're planning on running one in January. More on that in due course. So thank you all very much, and goodbye.
Great, thank you.